Hi there, in this video I'm going to show you how to install Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2016 in a virtual machine. Now you can use any virtualization software that you wish. For this video though, I'm using VMware Workstation 12, which is a free download, and I've already installed that on my machine. Software wise, you're going to require obviously a copy of Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2016. You will need a copy of Windows Server. I'm using Windows Server 2012 64-bit standard edition, and you're also going to need SQL Server 2014. In this case I'm using the standard edition with Service Pack 1. You can use any version of SQL Server 2012, 2014. Just make sure it's not an Express version and that you are installing the ISO with the latest Service Pack. So try and keep as up to date as possible to make for a smoother install, if you will. I've also downloaded the Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2016 SDK, which you will eventually need to install on your virtual machine once it's up and running. And then you'll also need to install Visual Studio. I would recommend Visual Studio 2015 Community Edition. It is free for non-commercial use, so it's pretty much the professional version of Visual Studio. I've already installed VMware Workstation Player on my machine, so I'm going to go through the process of installing Windows Server first. Once I've done that, then we just need to configure the server, and then we will install SQL Server, and then finally Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2016. I'm going to create a new virtual machine. I will point to my Windows Server 2012 ISO. If you have an MSDN subscription, you can download these ISO files. I'm just going to use the Windows Server 2012 Standard Edition. Not worry about the key for now, just click Next. I'm going to store it on my desktop. I've created a folder, CRM2K16, and then just hit Next. So 60 gigs is fine for the default. I'll just customize the hardware and I'll bump up the virtual memory to 4 gigs. Everything else can be left the same. And then I'm going to power up the virtual machine after creation, and I'll click Finish. I get this prompt in VMware for software updates, so when you first install it and you run it, it does ask you if you want to look for the latest VMware Tools version and install it. I always click Remind Me Later, simply because I'm installing the operating system right now and I don't really want that to be interfered with. So this process will go ahead and install. Once Windows Server 2012 has installed, the window will be the Server Manager window, which will display, and it will ask you to configure this local server. So we're going to need to add some roles and features. So let's go ahead and click that. Now, one thing I want to point out is this little message here. Before you continue, verify that the following tasks have been completed. The one we need to pay attention to is this one. The administrator account has a strong password. So when we installed Windows Server 2012, I didn't actually specify any passwords at the time. When it actually comes time to install these features, it will actually fail because the administrative account needs a strong password. And I'm not going to do it now. I'm going to actually follow the process and just go through it and then wait till I get the error, and then we can kind of step through fixing that. The other two notes here, you don't really need to worry about in this case. So I'm going to hit Next. Role-based or feature-based installation. Select the server from the server pool. This is the server we just installed. First thing I'm going to need to install is Active Directory Domain Services. And the other thing we're going to need is Web Server IIS. So let's go ahead and click Next. Now I'm going to just leave everything default. There are a few things that we're going to need to install in due time, but I'd rather just deal with them as they come up so I can show you how to get around these particular small little gotchas. So let's go ahead and click Next. So if I scroll down the list here, I'm just going to leave everything default. I will select Windows Authentication, click Next. Okay, so the installation process has succeeded. Now you'll notice in Active Directory Domain Services, it says that there's some additional steps that are required to make this machine a domain controller. Promote this server to a domain controller. So go ahead and click that. We're going to add a new forest, and the root domain name, you can call it whatever you want. I just typically call mine dev.local. Now for the controller options, I'm going to deselect domain name system, DNS server. This is not going to be a DNS server. We're not going to worry about that. Obviously in a production environment, you'll pay more attention to these domain controller options and so forth, but for this particular video and demonstrating to you how to set up CRM in your virtualized environment, it really isn't necessary. It'll verify the net BIOS name. Okay, so let's go ahead and click next. Leave these as default. Now it's going to run some prerequisites, and we get ourselves our very first error. So, verification of prerequisites for domain controller promotion failed. The local administrator account becomes a domain administrator account when you create a new domain. The new domain cannot be created because the local administrator account password does not meet the requirements. Right back at the beginning of this, when I showed you those 3 little bullet points, and that the first bullet point regarding the administrator password is going to come back to haunt us, well, it has. So let's go and deal with that now. The quickest way to deal with it is just simply go to your, let's minimize everything. Let's go to our desktop. Okay, so let's just click on control panel. Let's go to control panel, user accounts. And we're going to need to manage another account. So the first thing here is, this is the account that I actually created when I installed Windows Server 2012. So this is my local account. Now this is the local admin account that Windows Server has created by default as well. So it creates 2 accounts. It creates an administrator account and also an inactive guest account. So for this administrative account here, I need to create a password. So this is the password that we need to set. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay, so now that that's set, we can go back to our setup. So let me go ahead and come here. And now let's rerun the prerequisite check. Let's see what happens now. Also, I just want to quickly point out while this is doing its thing that if you did go to install the VMware Workstation Tools, the update, this you can actually reboot this virtual machine into full screen mode. So if I click full screen mode right now, as you can see, it's not really full screen, so it needs to install the latest VMware Workstation Tools to take advantage of that. So to do that, you would go Player, Manage, Install VMware Tools, and that would install the updates necessary for you to boot into full screen mode, and it also has Unity mode as well. Okay, so all prerequisite checks have passed successfully. Click Install to begin. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so the server was successfully configured as a domain controller. Now it's going to prompt me that the computer is about to sign me off, and it's going to restart. Okay, now that we've rebooted the system and we now have our machine as a domain controller, we can now go ahead and install SQL Server 2014 or whichever version that you have. So I'm going to point my virtual machine's drive, ISO image file drive, to SQL Server 2014. Okay, let's run the setup. Okay, let's just click on installation, new SQL Server standalone installation. SQL Server install can be a little bit finicky, so depending on which version you have, you may run into certain problems and issues. So for this version, I'm just going to go ahead and click next. So this is 2014. I accept the license terms. So it's going to run a rule check. I'm going to click use Microsoft Update to check for updates. So this will just run through and update anything if necessary. Okay, so we get a few warnings. Computer domain controller. What it basically suggests is that installing SQL Server on a domain controller is not recommended. I can say that installing Microsoft Dynamics CRM and SQL Server on a domain controller is not recommended. But again, for the purposes of getting this up and running as a developer environment machine, that's fine. But in a production environment, again, a lot of these settings are going to be customized to whatever your infrastructure's requirements are. So let's go ahead and click next. We're going to select SQL Server feature installation. Now all we really need is we're going to need reporting services, native reporting services. This is because Microsoft Dynamics CRM runs on reporting services for the reports, SSRS, so we're going to require that. We are also going to require the full text and semantic extractions for search. And we will require management tools complete. Let's go ahead and click next. So it's basically failed a pre-check, and the pre-check is Microsoft.NET Framework 3.5 Service Pack 1 is required. We could have avoided this right at the beginning when we were installing Active Directory and IIS by specifying certain features within IIS, one of them being the .NET 3.5 framework. But I wanted to do this deliberately to show the pain points that can occur when installing. So before we can proceed, we're going to have to install the .NET framework. So I'm going to minimize this. Now we're going to need to go back to the server manager, and we're going to need to add roles and features. Go ahead and click next on the defaults again. Now for IIS, which is installed, we're going to click next again. Here we are going to need to specify .NET framework 3.5 features. We're going to need to install that. That'll install 2 and 3. Click next. Now before you proceed, what it might say is, in my case it does, do you need to specify an alternate source path? One or more installation selections are missing source files on the destination. Now my virtual machine right now in the virtual drive is pointing to my SQL Server installation, so I need to change that, otherwise this is going to fail. So unfortunately I'm going to have to cancel the installation for SQL Server. We will come back to that. Actually, let's try and just leave it as is for now. So oops, I just closed the wrong window. So we need to point to again back to Windows Server. So let's go to our CD drive. Go to settings, and let's repoint this back to our Windows Server 2012. Click OK, it's connected. Down the bottom here, it'll say specify an alternate source path. So in this case, source files for .NET 3.5 features are not installed as part of a typical installation, but are available in the side-by-side store SXS folder. So if we actually open up the virtual drive, so if we put this by the side, if you look, it says eDrive sources SXS. So this is actually D drive, so D drive sources SXS. So let's just copy that and let's just paste that in here like so, and let's specify that and let's install. If it's not pointing to the right directory, it will fail. It takes its time to tell you that it's going to fail. It'll actually look like it's progressing fine, and then the feature installation will actually get about halfway, around about this point, and it'll actually show you a red bar at the top complaining that it couldn't find the location. So it can be a little deceiving, but hopefully we're going to avoid that by specifying that path. So again, when you specify the alternate for 3.5 framework, it's going to be your ISO D drive or E drive or whatever drive it is that has the ISO file on /sources/SXS. Okay, so let's go ahead and close that. Okay, so installation succeeded, so we can close that. Now we can rerun this now. Actually, before I do that, let's go ahead and change our drive again, our virtual drive. So it's currently pointing to Windows. Let's point it back to SQL Server. I know there's a little pain points here, but it's critical, and I think it's good to understand them and learn them to avoid this in the future. The first few installations will be a little tedious, but as you get better at it, I can assure you that the process gets much faster. I can get this down, everything installed within 30 minutes, no problems. So now that we're pointing to the right ISO file again, let's rerun the check, and as you see this time, yeah, we've got it. So it proceeds to the instance configuration screen, so I'm just going to leave it as default. Okay, so we'll now be directed to the server configuration screen. Now for the defaults, I'm actually going to set the startup type for automatic for everything. The only thing I can't change is the full text filter daemon launch, but everything else I'm going to set to automatic. When you actually install Microsoft Dynamics CRM, it will try to find your instance of SQL Server, and if the SQL Server browser or any of the features are not running at the time when it searches, it's not going to be able to locate it, and it's going to potentially cause you headaches. So to avoid that, let's set everything to automatic startup type that we can. Go ahead and click next. Now I'm going to use mixed mode, which is SQL Server authentication in Windows. Now if you remember back when we were installing Windows Server, we did select in the IIS features Windows authentication, so this is where it actually comes into play. I'm going to use mixed mode, so I'll enter a password for my SA account, and I'll add the current user to the SQL Server administrators, and then just go ahead and click next. That's fine. And then we're going to install and configure, let it work its magic. So it's going to give you a summary screen of what is going to be installed, and let's just go ahead and install it. Okay, so after about 15 minutes or so, we've reached the end of the install. Everything was successful. So let's go ahead and close this, and we can close out our installation. So let's recap quickly. We've installed Windows Server 2012. We've made the installation, configured it for a domain controller. We've then added IIS with a few extra configurations, namely the .NET 3.5 framework. When we went to install SQL Server, we encountered that error. And we've also installed SQL Server 2014. So that leaves Microsoft Dynamics CRM. So that's the last thing that we can install. So let's go back to our removable devices, our SATA virtual drive, and let's point to Microsoft Dynamics CRM. Click OK, and let's run the executable, run the splash, and we're going to install Microsoft Dynamics CRM Server. Get updates from Microsoft Dynamics CRM recommended. Let's go ahead and do that. Now, depending on when you download the Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2016 ISO from the MSDN subscription, you may or may not receive a download update. In my case, I've had this for a while, so I believe it's in release update 1. Okay, so now that that's finished, let's go ahead and click next. Okay, so we're going to need our product key. Accept the license agreement. Now, for this version of Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2016, it will install the Microsoft .NET 4.5.2 framework, which will require a reboot once it's installed. Now, you can actually avoid this before you install Microsoft Dynamics CRM. If you install Visual Studio 2015 Community Edition, it will install the Microsoft Dynamics 4.5.2 framework. While it's actually installing the .NET framework, because I'm going to have to reboot it anyway, I'm going to take this opportunity to install the VMware tools. I'm actually getting frustrated with this being unable to go full screen, so while it's doing that, I will install the update. Okay, so now that I've downloaded the VMware Tools update, I'm just going to run it quickly. This will install the files required to get extra features out of the VMware Tools. As you can see, my Microsoft .NET Framework 4.5.2 has been installed and requires a reboot. So before I do that, I'm going to make sure that I have the VMware Tools installed as well. So when I do reboot, I can go into full screen mode. You can do this, actually, install the VMware Tools anytime. I just kind of left it till last just to show you the installation process in general. Okay, so typical install, and let's just go ahead and install that. Okay, so it's completed, so we'll click finish, and you must restart your system. That's perfect because we need to restart it anyway because we've installed the 4.5.2 framework. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so we've installed 4.5.2 framework and we've also installed the VMware Tools update. So now if I go into full screen, look what we've got, a full screen. So we're going to need to go back and reinstall Dynamics CRM. So with that, let's just go back to our removable devices, our SATA virtual drive, make sure we're pointing to Dynamics CRM, click OK, and then we shall run the installer, install Microsoft Dynamics CRM, next. Accept this license, go ahead. Now it will continue to install the application error reporting component, native client, CLR types, management objects, and SQL reporting services report viewer. Let's go ahead and click install. Okay, so everything's been installed. Let's go ahead and click next. Let's just leave the installation directory as default. We're going to leave all the roles set to default, everything's selected. Click next. Now for this here, we're going to click this little refresh button here. Now if you remember me saying when we installed SQL Server that we set all our services to automatic startup. So this is where it performs this check, and if any of those services have stopped, then it's quite possible that you won't be able to locate your instance running SQL Server. So in my case, I've found it because I have all my services set to automatic start. Go ahead and click next. Our organizational unit, I'm just going to select dev from our domain controller that we created. Now for the accounts here, I'm just going to specify NT Authority Network Service for all of them. This isn't good practice. What you would do typically in a production environment is you would have service accounts for each one and their own passwords to make it more secure, and it will actually recommend that you specify a different least privileged account for each service. We'll leave our default website. We're not going to install the email router at this point, so just go ahead and click next. Now our display name is what the Dynamics CRM will display to us, so I'm just going to call this Jeremy's org. This will be the database name, the unique database name. I'm going to use US dollars for the currency. Now when you specify these settings here, you only get one chance. If you need to change them, you're going to have to install Microsoft Dynamics CRM again. So make sure when you set this up that you are happy with everything. Go ahead and click next. This will be the report server URL, and let's just go ahead and click next. It'll run through system checks now. It'll verify everything. If anything is missing, this is where you will see the errors. So it will check that your operating system is correct. It will check that Internet Information Services, IIS, has been configured. Microsoft SQL Server has been configured. SQL Server Reporting Services has been configured, and Active Directory. It also mentions here that for a more secure deployment, it recommends that the services that we configured earlier should run under a least privileged domain user account that is not shared by any other Microsoft Dynamics CRM services on this computer. So again, in a production environment, you should have separate services running Microsoft Dynamics CRM. Let's go ahead and click next. Again, you'll get the review screen ready to install. Let's just install it. Okay, so after about 15-20 minutes, the Microsoft Dynamics CRM setup will be complete. I'm going to just deselect this launch reporting extension setup, click finish. And now we just need to verify that we're actually configured. So open up a browser and just simply browse to localhost. Now the first time this fires up, it can take up to a minute to display. We have successfully installed Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2016 in a virtualized environment. So let's recap quickly what we did in this video. We installed Windows Server 2012. We configured Windows Server to be a domain controller. We also installed IIS. Then we installed SQL Server 2014. And then we installed Microsoft Dynamics CRM 2016.